The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as Captain David Mitchell adjusted his red uniform jacket one final time. 8 years he had stood at these gates, 8 years of watching the world go by, while remaining perfectly still, like a statue brought to life only when duty demanded it. The heavy brass buttons on his jacket caught the early light, and his black boots reflected the sky above. Today felt like any other day, but David had learned that the most ordinary moments could change everything in an instant. The palace gates stood tall and proud, their intricate ironwork telling stories of kings and queens from centuries past. Tourists gathered every morning like clockwork, cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty, or at least take a picture with the famous guards who never moved, never smiled, never acknowledged the outside world. David had grown used to the constant chatter, the flashing cameras, and the occasional child who would wave enthusiastically at him, disappointed when he didn't wave back. His partner for the day, Sergeant Robert Hayes, took his position on the opposite side of the grand entrance. They had worked together dozens of times before, and their silent communication had become an art form. A slight nod, a barely noticeable shift in posture, a glance in a particular direction. These tiny signals kept them connected, even when they couldn't speak. Robert was younger, only 3 years on the job, but he had the same dedication that David respected in all good guards. The first group of tourists arrived around 9:30, a mix of families from different countries, their excited voices creating a symphony of languages David had learned to recognize over the years. German, French, Japanese, Spanish. The palace drew visitors from every corner of the world. Parents would lift their children up for better views. Teenagers would pose for selfies with the guards in the background, and elderly couples would stand arm in arm, remembering their own youth while admiring the pageantry. David's training had been thorough and unforgiving. Stand straight, eyes forward, no reactions to anything happening around him. The instructors had put them through every scenario imaginable during those grueling months of preparation. Children crying, people trying to make them laugh, even protesters shouting inches from their faces. A royal guard must remain unmoved through it all. The uniform represented something bigger than any individual person. It represented history, tradition, and the unwavering stability of the crown itself. But standing there, hour after hour, David often found his mind wandering to the people he protected and served. Behind those ornate walls lived real people with real problems, just like everyone else. The weight of responsibility never left his shoulders. Every person who approached the gates could be a threat, or simply someone who needed help. The balance between vigilance and approachability was delicate, and getting it wrong could mean the difference between life and death. Around 10:15, a yellow school bus pulled up to the nearby curb, its brakes hissing as it came to a stop. David watched from his peripheral vision as children began filing out, their high-pitched voices adding a new energy to the morning air. School groups visited regularly, part of their history lessons brought to life. Teachers would gather their students, pointing out architectural details and sharing stories about the monarchs who had walked these very paths. This particular group looked to be around 7 or 8 years old, that perfect age where wonder and curiosity hadn't yet been dimmed by the complications of growing up. Their teacher, a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and infinite patience, began organizing them into a neat line. Some children bounced with excitement, others hung back shyly, and a few seemed more interested in the pigeons pecking at crumbs near their feet than in the historic building before them. David noticed her almost immediately, a small girl with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, while her classmates chattered and pointed. She stood quietly at the edge of the group, her big brown eyes taking in everything with unusual seriousness. There was something different about her, something that made David's protective instincts stir, even though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was. The teacher began her well-rehearsed explanation about the palace, its history, and the role of the guards. David had heard these speeches hundreds of times, but he never tired of seeing the wonder in children's faces when they learned about the traditions he helped preserve. Most kids would lose interest after a few minutes and start whispering to their friends or wandering slightly away from the group, but this particular girl remained focused, almost studying him with an intensity that was remarkable for someone so young. As the minutes passed, David began to notice other things about her behavior that seemed unusual. While her classmates moved freely within their designated area, she stayed close to her teacher, occasionally glancing over her shoulder toward the street. Her hands fidgeted with the strap of her small backpack, and she seemed to be listening to something beyond the teacher's voice, as if waiting for a sound that worried her. The morning progressed normally in every other way. Tour groups came and went, cameras clicked, and the usual mix of admiration and curiosity surrounded the guards. Robert maintained his position flawlessly, and David felt the familiar rhythm of another routine day settling into place. The sun climbed higher, warming the stone beneath their feet, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers from the palace gardens. But his attention kept returning to the quiet girl, who seemed so different from her peers. During a brief moment, when the teacher was answering another student's question, David saw her turn and look directly at him. Their eyes met for just a second, and in that instant, he saw something that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't the typical curiosity or amusement he usually saw in children's faces. It was fear, raw, genuine fear that had no place in the eyes of someone so young. The moment passed quickly as her teacher called the group to attention for their next lesson. But David couldn't shake what he had seen. His years of training and experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling him that something was very wrong. The little girl was scared of something, and that something was close by. As the school group prepared for the next part of their tour, David found himself breaking one of the cardinal rules of his position. Instead of keeping his gaze fixed straight ahead, he began to subtly scan the crowd, looking for whatever had put such fear into a child's eyes. The answer, he realized, might be closer than anyone imagined. The teacher clapped her hands twice, the sound echoing off the stone walls as she gathered her students' attention. David watched from his rigid position as the children began forming their familiar line, some still craning their necks for one last look at the palace windows, others already thinking about their next destination. The morning tour was coming to an end, just like hundreds of others he had witnessed over the years. "All right, everyone, time to head back to the bus," the teacher announced, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had managed groups of excited children many times before. "Stay with your buddy and remember what we learned about walking in a straight line." Most of the children eagerly began moving toward the street where their yellow bus waited, chattering about what they had seen and learned. But David noticed that the quiet girl with the dark ponytail wasn't moving with the rest of the group. She stood near the iron gate, her small hands wrapped around the metal bars, looking up at him with those same serious brown eyes that had caught his attention earlier. The teacher was busy counting heads and organizing the departure, helping tie shoelaces and ensuring everyone had their belongings. In the controlled chaos of managing 20 young children, she hadn't yet noticed that one of her students had lingered behind. David felt a strange pull of concern, though he couldn't understand why this particular child affected him so deeply. "Lucy, come along now," the teacher finally called, noticing the girl's absence from the group. "We don't want to keep everyone waiting." So her name was Lucy. David filed this information away, though he still couldn't break his stance to acknowledge her directly. Protocol was clear: no interaction with civilians, no matter how young or seemingly harmless. But something about her behavior continued to set off alarm bells in his mind. She wasn't acting like a typical child who simply didn't want the field trip to end. Lucy glanced toward her teacher and nodded. But instead of immediately joining the group, she took a step closer to the gate. Her movement was deliberate, purposeful in a way that seemed far too mature for someone her age. David's training had taught him to notice details, and every detail about this moment felt significant. The girl looked around quickly, as if checking to make sure no one was watching her too closely. Then, with movements so subtle they could have been mistaken for nervous fidgeting, she began positioning her hands near the gate bars. David's breath caught in his throat as he realized what she was doing. Sign language. She was using sign language. David's military background included basic communication training for situations where verbal contact was impossible or dangerous. He wasn't fluent, but he knew enough to recognize the deliberate hand positions and movements. Lucy's small fingers were forming letters and simple words. Her eyes locked on his face to see if he understood. Help. The first word came slowly, each letter carefully formed. David's heart began beating faster, though his exterior remained perfectly composed. Years of discipline kept his expression neutral, but inside, every instinct was screaming that this was serious. A 7-year-old child didn't learn military hand signals by accident, and she certainly wouldn't use them unless something was terribly wrong. Lucy paused, glancing once more toward her classmates, who were now boarding the bus. The teacher was helping another child with a dropped pencil case, still unaware that one of her students was desperately trying to communicate with a palace guard. The girl turned back to David and continued her silent message. Dion. Word formed letter by letter, each movement precise despite her obvious nervousness. David's mind raced. Where had she learned this? Why was she using it now? His eyes began to scan the area more systematically, looking for whatever threat had prompted such an unusual plea for help. The morning crowd looked normal. Tourists taking photos, people walking to work, the usual mix of faces that made up any day in Londonman. Lucy's hands continued moving. Following. The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. Someone was following this child, and she was smart enough and brave enough to seek help from the only authority figure she could reach. But why hadn't she told her teacher? David's protective instincts warred with his duty to maintain protocol, creating an internal battle unlike anything he had experienced during his years of service. Lucy's final sign was simpler, but carried more weight than all the others combined. CRID. David's eyes swept the crowd again, this time with laser focus. That's when he saw him, a man in a dark coat standing about 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a group of tourists taking photos. At first glance, he looked like any other person enjoying a morning in the city, but there were details that didn't fit. He wasn't taking pictures like the tourists around him. He wasn't walking with purpose like the commuters heading to work. He was simply standing there, watching. More importantly, he was watching Lucy. The man appeared to be in his 30s or 40s, with brown hair and an average build that would make him easy to forget in a crowd. His coat was long and dark, probably navy or black, and he kept his hands in his pockets. What set David's nerves on edge was the way the man's attention never wavered from the school group, and specifically from the little girl, who was now slowly backing away from the gate. David had seen enough predators during his military service to recognize the signs. The patient waiting, the careful positioning to avoid drawing attention, the intense focus on a single target. This man wasn't a concerned parent or a casual observer. He was hunting. Lucy seemed to sense that her message had been received. She glanced once more at the man in the dark coat, and David saw her small body tense with fear. The child knew she was being watched, knew she was in danger, and had been brave enough to reach out for help in the only way she could think of. The teacher's voice carried across the courtyard again, more urgent this time. Lucy, we really need to go now, sweetheart. The little girl looked torn between obeying her teacher and staying near the safety of the palace gates. David watched her internal struggle, recognizing the terrible position she was in. How could a child her age explain that someone dangerous was following her? Who would believe such a story from someone so young? But David believed her. Every fiber of his being told him that this child was in real danger, and that the man in the dark coat was the source of that threat. The question now was what he could do about it, without abandoning his post and breaking every rule he had sworn to uphold. Lucy took a reluctant step toward her classmates, then stopped and looked back at David one final time. Her eyes held a desperate hope that someone, finally, had understood her silent cry for help. David's mind was racing faster than his heart, and that was saying something. 8 years of perfect service, 8 years of following every rule without question, 8 years of putting protocol above everything else. And now, in the space of a few terrifying minutes, all of that training was being tested by the silent plea of a 7-year-old girl. He watched Lucy take another reluctant step toward her classmates, her small shoulders tense with fear. The man in the dark coat had shifted his position slightly, moving closer to the bus while trying to maintain his casual appearance. David's trained eye caught every detail, the way the man's gaze never left Lucy, how he timed his movements to stay just outside the teacher's peripheral vision. The predatory patience that made David's skin crawl. This was the moment every guard dreaded and hoped would never come. The moment when duty and humanity collided head-on, forcing a choice that could change everything. David's commanding officer had been clear during training. Your job is to protect the royal family and maintain the dignity of your position. Nothing else matters. Nothing else can matter. But looking at Lucy's frightened face, David realized his commanding officer had been wrong. Sometimes other things didn't matter. Sometimes a child's safety mattered more than perfect protocol. The teacher was growing more insistent, her voice carrying a note of frustration. Lucy, sweetie, everyone is waiting for you. We have to leave now, or we'll be late for lunch. Back at school. Lucy glanced at her teacher, then back at David, her eyes pleading for him to do something, anything, to help her. The trust in her gaze hit him like a physical blow. This child had risked everything to ask for his help, using a communication method she probably learned from a family member or friend. She was depending on him to understand, to act, to be the protector she desperately needed. David made a decision that would haunt and define the rest of his career. First, he needed to alert Robert without causing panic or drawing the stalkers' attention. Using the subtle hand signals that guards developed over years of silent partnership, David caught his colleague's attention. A slight shift in his stance, a barely noticeable gesture with his left hand, a meaningful glance toward the crowd. Robert's eyes sharpened immediately, recognizing that something serious was happening. David used their coded system to convey the essential information. Child in danger. Suspicious male. Need backup. Stay alert. Robert's response was immediate and professional. Message received. Standing by. Ready to assist. The communication took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity to David. Every second that passed was another second that Lucy remained in danger. Another moment that the man in the dark coat could make his move. The predator was getting bolder now, edging closer to the school group as they prepared to board the bus. Lucy had joined her classmates, but kept looking back toward the palace gates. Toward David, her silent guardian, who she hoped would find a way to help her. The teacher was doing a final head count, checking that everyone had their belongings and was ready for the journey back to school. In just a few minutes, the bus would pull away, taking Lucy with it and making it much harder for David to protect her. That's when David did something he had never done in 8 years of flawless service. He stepped away from his post. The movement felt strange after so many hours, days, and years of absolute stillness. His legs responded automatically, carrying him toward the gate where Lucy stood with her group. Every step was a violation of his training, every movement a break from the sacred protocol that had governed his entire career. "Excuse me," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper as he approached the iron bars of the gate. Lucy's eyes widened with hope and relief. She had been heard. She had been understood. Someone was finally going to help her. The teacher looked up in surprise, clearly not expecting one of the famous silent guards to speak. "Oh, hello there. Is everything all right?" David's heart was pounding, so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. Breaking protocol felt like breaking a sacred oath. But looking at Lucy's frightened face reminded him why he had become a guard in the first place. He wasn't here just to stand still and look impressive. He was here to protect people. "Miss, I need to speak with you about your student's safety," David said, keeping his voice low and calm despite the urgency he felt. "There's a man who has been watching your group very closely, and I'm concerned about his intentions." The teacher's expression shifted from surprise to worry in an instant. "What? Where?" David subtly indicated the direction where the man in the dark coat was standing, trying not to make it obvious what he was doing. "Dark coat, brown hair, about 30 meters to your left near the newspaper stand. He's been following your group for the past 20 minutes. Lucy pressed closer to her teacher, her small hand grabbing onto the woman's jacket. "That's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He was at our school yesterday too, and at the park where my mom takes me." The teacher's face went pale as the full implications hit her. This wasn't just David being overly cautious. This was a real threat to one of her students. A threat that could have had devastating consequences if not for the sharp eyes of a palace guard who cared more about protecting a child than following rules. "What should we do?" the teacher asked, instinctively moving to shield Lucy with her body. David was already reaching for his radio. Another major protocol violation that could cost him his job, but he didn't care anymore. Some things were more important than job security. "Security, this is gate position 1, he spoke into his radio, his voice steady, despite the chaos in his mind. "I need immediate assistance for a potential threat to civilian safety. We have what appears to be a stalking situation involving a minor." The response crackled back immediately. "Gate 1, you are not authorized to leave your post or engage with civilians. Return to position immediately." David looked at Lucy, at her teacher, at the man in the dark coat, who was now clearly aware that something was happening. The stalker was beginning to back away, realizing that his cover had been blown. "Negative control," David replied into his radio, knowing that these words would likely end his career. "I have a child in immediate danger. Protocol be damned." The man in the dark coat knew he had been spotted. David watched as the stalker's casual demeanor evaporated in an instant, replaced by the panicked movements of someone whose carefully planned hunt had been exposed. What happened next would determine whether a child remained safe, or whether a predator escaped to threaten her another day. "He's moving," David spoke urgently into his radio, his eyes tracking the man as he began walking quickly away from the school group. "Subject is male, approximately 40 years old, dark navy coat, brown hair, heading south, toward the main road." The teacher pulled Lucy closer, her protective instincts fully activated now that she understood the real danger her student had been facing. Other children in the group sensed that something serious was happening, their cheerful chatter dying down as they noticed the tension in their teacher's voice and the presence of the palace guard who was no longer standing perfectly still. "Everyone stay close to me," the teacher instructed her class, her voice steady despite the fear David could see in her eyes. "We're going to wait here for just a few more minutes." David's radio crackled with responses from multiple security units. The palace security team, Metropolitan Police, and plainclothes officers, who were always stationed around the tourist areas, began coordinating their response. Years of training and preparation for exactly this type of situation kicked into gear, but David knew that every second counted. "Control to all units. We have a code yellow situation. Suspect is on foot, heading away from the palace gates. We need eyes on all exit routes. came the professional voice through the radio system that connected every security officer in the area. Robert maintained his position at the opposite gate, but David could see the alertness in his partner's stance. They had worked together long enough for David to know that Robert was ready to assist in any way possible while ensuring that palace security wasn't completely compromised. The balance between protecting their assigned post and helping with this emergency required split-second decision-making. The man in the dark coat was moving faster now, weaving between tourists and morning commuters as he tried to blend into the crowd, but his hurried pace and frequent glances over his shoulder made him stand out to anyone who knew what to look for. David's military training had taught him how to track targets in populated areas, and this man was making classic mistakes that would make him easier to follow. Unit 7, I have visual contact, came a voice over the radio. Subject is approaching the intersection near the coffee shop, still heading south. Lucy tugged on her teacher's jacket, her small voice barely audible above the radio chatter. He was outside our school yesterday when Mum picked me up. She didn't see him, but I did. He was sitting on the bench across the street, just watching. David's blood ran cold as he realized this wasn't a random encounter. This man had been stalking Lucy for days, possibly weeks, learning her routines and waiting for the right opportunity. The school trip had probably seemed like the perfect chance to get close to her in a crowded, chaotic environment where one missing child might not be noticed immediately. How long has this been going on, sweetheart? The teacher asked gently, kneeling down to Lucy's eye level while keeping one protective arm around her. I first saw him at the park 3 weeks ago, Lucy whispered. Granddad was teaching me sign language so I could talk to him when his hearing aid batteries died. I remembered what Granddad said about telling grown-ups if someone scary was following me. The pieces of Lucy's remarkable response began falling into place. Her grandfather, who was deaf or hard of hearing, had taught her basic sign language for family communication, but he had also given her something infinitely more valuable, the awareness to recognize danger and the tools to ask for help when speaking out loud wasn't safe or possible. David's radio buzzed with an update that sent a chill down his spine. Control, Unit 4 here. Subject has entered the underground station. We're coordinating with Transport Police to monitor all platforms. The London Underground system was vast and complex, with dozens of exits and connections that could allow someone to disappear completely within minutes. If the stalker reached the trains, tracking him would become exponentially more difficult. David found himself silently urging the pursuing officers to move faster, to close the gap before their target vanished into the maze of tunnels beneath the city. Unit 7 to control. We have him cornered at the ticket barriers. He's trying to purchase a travel card but seems agitated, requesting backup for approach and detainment. David felt a surge of relief, mixed with anticipation. They were close to stopping this threat, but the most dangerous moment was often when a cornered predator realized escape was impossible. Training had taught him that desperate people made unpredictable choices, and those choices could endanger innocent bystanders. The teacher was speaking quietly to Lucy, reassuring her that she had done the right thing and that the scary man would be caught. Other children in the class had gathered around, sensing that their classmate was the center of whatever drama was unfolding. Their innocent questions about why the guard wasn't standing still anymore and why their teacher looked worried created a backdrop of childhood confusion against the serious adult business of protecting them. Control to all units. Subject is in custody. Repeat. Subject has been detained without incident at the underground station. Well done, everyone. The collective sigh of relief that went through David's radio was audible, but he knew this was only the beginning. Catching the stalker was crucial, but understanding the full scope of the threat he had posed would require investigation and evidence gathering. The answers to those questions would determine just how much danger Lucy had really been in. Within 30 minutes, Detective Inspector Williams arrived at the palace gates with news that confirmed David's worst fears and validated his decision to break protocol. The man they had arrested wasn't just a casual opportunist. He was a registered offender with a history of targeting young children, and the evidence found in his possession painted a terrifying picture of his plans. He had photographs of the child, detailed notes about her schedule, and maps of routes between her school and home. Detective Williams explained to David and the teacher, speaking quietly so the children couldn't overhear. He'd been planning this for weeks, waiting for the right moment to make contact, or worse. The detective's investigation revealed that the stalker had been following Lucy not just for days, but for nearly a month. He had learned her routine, identified her favorite places, and even discovered her family's weekend activities. The school trip to the palace had represented the perfect opportunity, a crowded, exciting environment where a child might become separated from her group without immediate notice. If you hadn't acted when you did, Detective Williams continued, there's no telling what might have happened. This individual had the means and opportunity to cause serious harm. Lucy's brave decision to learn sign language from her grandfather had quite literally saved her life. And David's choice to put her safety above protocol had prevented a tragedy that could have destroyed multiple families. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday morning, and David spent the weekend wondering if he would still have a job by lunchtime. 8 years of perfect service, countless commendations, and a spotless record, all of it potentially erased by a single moment when he chose to put a child's safety above the sacred rules that governed his position. His commanding officer, Colonel Thompson, had been clear during their initial meeting. Captain Mitchell, I understand your motivations, and I respect what you were trying to accomplish. But the protocols exist for important reasons. We cannot have guards abandoning their posts whenever they feel it's justified, no matter how noble their intentions. David understood the colonel's position, but he couldn't bring himself to feel regret for his actions. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lucy's frightened face and her desperate sign language plea for help. No protocol in the world was worth ignoring a child in danger, and he would make the same choice again without hesitation. The story had somehow leaked to the media, probably through one of the many witnesses who had seen the unusual sight of a palace guard leaving his post and speaking to civilians. By Sunday evening, David's phone was ringing constantly with reporters wanting to interview the hero guard who saved a little girl. He ignored them all, but he couldn't ignore the growing pile of letters that began arriving at the palace. People from all over the country had heard about what happened and wanted to express their support. A grandmother from Scotland wrote that David reminded her of her late husband, who had also been a soldier willing to break rules for the right reasons. A group of teachers from Wales sent a card signed by dozens of students, thanking him for protecting one of their own. Even other military personnel reached out, sharing stories of times when they had faced similar impossible choices between duty and humanity. Lucy's parents requested a meeting with David before the disciplinary hearing, and the palace agreed to arrange it in a private room away from the media attention that had been growing each day. When David walked into the small conference room, he found not just Lucy's mother and father, but also an elderly man with kind eyes who was introduced as Lucy's grandfather. Captain Mitchell, Lucy's mother began, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you for what you did. If you hadn't listened to Lucy, if you hadn't acted when you did. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood how close they had come to an unthinkable tragedy. Lucy's father, a quiet man who worked as an accountant, struggled to find words adequate for the situation. The police told us about the evidence they found. That man had been planning this for weeks. He knew everything about our daughter's routine, her favorite places, even where we lived. Without your intervention, our family would have been destroyed. But it was Lucy's grandfather who provided the most moving testimony. I taught my granddaughter sign language so we could talk when my hearing aids weren't working properly, he explained, his weathered hands demonstrating some of the signs Lucy had used. I also taught her to recognize when adults were acting strangely, and to ask for help if she ever felt unsafe. I never imagined she would need to use those lessons to save her own life. The old man reached across the table and shook David's hand with surprising strength. You saw a child in need, and you acted. That's what real heroes do. Rules are important, but some things are more important than rules. Lucy herself was there too, no longer the frightened child from the palace gates, but a bright, confident little girl who wanted to show David the thank you card she had made for him. The drawing depicted a palace guard standing next to a little girl, both of them smiling under a rainbow. "You're my hero," she told him simply. And David felt his throat tighten with emotion. The disciplinary hearing on Monday morning was unlike anything David had experienced in his military career. The room was packed with officials, including several he didn't recognize who had apparently requested permission to observe. Colonel Thompson conducted the proceedings with military precision, reviewing the facts of the case and the specific protocols that had been violated. Captain Mitchell abandoned his assigned post without authorization, the colonel stated formally. He engaged with civilians in direct violation of standing orders. He used official communication channels for non-authorized purposes. These are serious breaches of conduct that cannot be overlooked. David stood at attention, prepared to accept whatever punishment was deemed appropriate. He had known the consequences when he made his choice, and he was ready to face them with dignity. That's when the door to the hearing room opened, and someone David had never expected to see walked in. The Queen's private secretary entered with an official-looking document, followed by several members of the royal household staff. The entire room rose respectfully as the secretary approached the panel conducting the hearing. "Colonel Thompson," the secretary announced formally, "I bring direct instructions from Her Majesty regarding this matter." What followed was unprecedented in the history of palace security. The Queen had not only personally reviewed the case, but had made a decision that would change everything. Rather than punishment, David was to be commended for his quick thinking and courageous actions. More importantly, the incident would prompt an immediate review of security protocols to ensure that similar situations could be handled more effectively in the future. Her Majesty wishes it to be known, the secretary continued, that the protection of innocent civilians, particularly children, is always consistent with the highest duties of those who serve the crown. Captain Mitchell's actions exemplified the very best traditions of service and sacrifice that define the Royal Guard. The changes that followed were swift and comprehensive. New protocols were established that allowed guards to request immediate assistance when civilian safety was at risk. Training programs were expanded to include recognition of potential threats to the public, not just to the royal family. Most importantly, the rigid rule about never leaving one's post was modified to include exceptions for emergency situations involving imminent danger to innocent people. David was not only cleared of all charges, but was promoted and asked to help develop the new training programs. His experience became a case study taught to every new guard, demonstrating that true service sometimes required the courage to think beyond rigid rules when lives were at stake. Lucy returned to the palace 6 months later with her school class for another field trip. This time, when she waved at the guards, David, now standing in a supervisory position, smiled and waved back. It was a small gesture, but it represented a fundamental change in how the palace guard viewed their role in protecting not just royalty, but all the people who looked to them as symbols of safety and security. The story of the guard who broke protocol to save a child became legendary, passed down through generations of palace security and inspiring countless others too. Remember that sometimes the most important rule is knowing when to break the rules for something more important than any protocol ever written.